You're making the biggest mistake of your life, Mr. Vance. This company will be carved up by noon.
Not while I'm breathing, Arthur. And I'm breathing just fine.
Your sentimentality is a liability. You brought in a stray and gave him a suit. That's not a succession plan, that's a charity case. The massive oak doors of the boardroom didn't creak, they surrendered. They swung open in absolute silence, and a young man in a charcoal suit walked in not as a guest, but like a man returning home. Arthur Crawley stopped mid-sentence. The silence was so profound you could hear the fluorescent lights hum their cold, indifferent song. The young man, barely 30, with eyes that had seen too much too young, didn't look at the 12 hostile board members. He only looked at the tired, weathered trucker at the head of the table and said, "Sorry I'm late, Mr. Vance. Traffic was a beast, but I brought something for our friends." From his briefcase, he drew not a weapon, but a single thick, bound document, the original Articles of Incorporation. If you live for stories where lifelong loyalty destroys cold-blooded greed, smash that like button, subscribe to this channel, and share this video with someone who needs to believe in justice. Stay until the final minute, because the secret this young man found in the margins of a 30-year-old promise will rewrite everything you know about family. The rain over Tulsa wasn't a soft spring shower. It was the kind of relentless, hammering Midwest thunderstorm that turned highways into rivers and windshields into blurred, abstract paintings of red taillights and flashing hazards. Eli Vance was 43 years old, but the steering wheel of his 18-wheeler had aged his hands a decade beyond that. The cab of his Peterbilt, Old Esther, smelled of diesel, burnt coffee from a truck stop thermos, and the quiet, unending solitude of a widower who had been talking to himself for 12 years. His wife, Esther, had passed from a fever that took her too fast, leaving Eli with an infant son named Leo, a small mortgage on a modest house, and a trucking business that consisted of one man, one rig, and a promise to deliver on time. He was a man carved from long silences and flat highways. His world was the rumble strip, the way station, and the fluorescent glow of all-night diners where waitresses knew his name and his order. It was a lonely life, but an honest one. He had raised Leo in the passenger seat, teaching him arithmetic with odometer numbers and geography with state license plates. The business, Vance & Son Logistics, was a figment of hope more than a reality, but it was his. That night, the storm was a living thing, clawing at the rig's chassis. Eli had taken a detour off the interstate to skirt a jackknifed semi, pushing Old Esther down a state route that was more pothole than pavement. His high beams cut a tunnel through the black rain, and that's when he saw it. A single, half-drowned figure on the side of the road, not walking, not hitching, just standing there, freezing, his arm extended like a question nobody wanted to answer. A boy, maybe 15 years old, drenched to the bone, wearing a t-shirt and jeans that hung off his thin frame like a surrendered flag. He wasn't carrying a bag, he wasn't holding a sign, he just stood there, freezing, his arm extended like a question nobody wanted to answer.
Eli Vance was a cautious man. The road had taught him that danger often wore a pitiful mask. A grown man, a lone trucker, and a kid on a stormy night. The situation was a trap waiting to happen. But Eli also had a rule, one he'd never broken, taught to him by his own father long ago. You don't drive past someone who's out of options, not in the rain, not in the cold, not ever. He didn't swing the door open with a warm smile. He wasn't a fool. He cracked the passenger window, the rain instantly lashing his face. He studied the boy. The kid's face was a mask of wariness and cold, his lips tinged blue. He looked like a stray dog that had been kicked so many times he'd forgotten the feel of a kind hand. Eli didn't ask a soft question. He didn't say, "Are you okay?" That was obvious. He pointed a thumb toward the back of the cab. "There's a dry blanket behind the seat," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble meant to calm, "and a thermos of coffee. It's black and bitter. If you want to ride, you get in, you get warm, and you don't touch anything. Understood? The boy just stared for a long, shivering moment. He was assessing the danger, the same way Eli was, a thorough, self-preserving calculation. Then, without a word, he nodded. He climbed into the cab, a wet, shivering collection of sharp angles and profound silence. He didn't reach for the blanket. He sat perfectly still, dripping on the worn upholstery, his eyes scanning the dashboard, the door handle, the potential exits. Eli pulled old Esther back onto the road. "I'm Eli," he said to the windshield. "What do I call you?" The boy's voice was a raw whisper, the sound of a throat unused to speaking. "They call me Finn. Finn. Just Finn." Eli didn't press. He drove for an hour in silence, letting the heater hum, the engine drone filling the space. He watched Finn from his peripheral vision. The kid slowly, tentatively reached for the blanket and wrapped it around his shoulders. A few minutes later, he unscrewed the thermos and took a tiny, scalding sip of the coffee. He didn't relax. His spine stayed rigid, but he stopped shivering. Eli knew the boy was afraid to sleep, terrified that closing his eyes in a stranger's truck would be the last thing he ever did. So Eli did something he hadn't done in years. He started talking. Not about anything important. He narrated the road. He pointed out the distant lights of a refinery, explaining how diesel was cracked. He told a rambling, pointless story about a stubborn raccoon that had held him hostage at a rest stop in Arkansas. He asked no questions about Finn's life, his past, or why a teenager was hitchhiking alone in a hurricane. He just filled the cab with a steady, low-frequency hum of harmless words, like a human lullaby of pure, meaningless safety. It was well past midnight when Finn finally spoke, unprompted. "Are you going to call the cops?" Eli considered the question with the gravity it deserved. "Depends. Are you running from something or running to something?" A long pause. "Away," Finn whispered. Eli nodded. He knew that direction. He had been running from grief for 12 years. "I'm headed to Omaha. Got a load of tractor parts. I can drop you at a Silter, a real one, with social workers." Finn flinched at the word. No shelters, no state homes. The finality in the boy's voice was a locked door. Eli understood that too. The system wasn't a safe haven for everyone. He sighed, a sound that came from deep within his chest. "I've got a small house on the edge of Omaha. It's nothing but a tool shed and a spare room. My son, Leo, he's about your age. If you want, you can clean up, get a meal, and we'll figure out the rest in the morning when the world isn't on fire. No strings, no paperwork. One night." That one night became a week. That week became a month. Eli, who had navigated the brutal web of freight brokerage, submitted to the far more terrifying labyrinth of becoming a legal guardian. He didn't have much, but he had a clean record, a spare bedroom, and a deep, stubborn streak of decency he had inherited from his father. Finn was not easy to love. He was skittish, silent, and prone to flinching at loud noises. He hoarded food in his room. But with Leo, something unlocked. Leo, who had always been the quieter, more studious counterpart to Eli's raw-boned practicality, saw a wounded bird and meticulously, patiently began to teach him how to trust again. They shared a room, then shared secrets. Eli officially fostered Finn. A year later, in a drab county office with flickering lights and a clerk who popped a gum bubble during the final decree, he adopted him. The boy with no last name became Finn Vance. On that day, Eli gave him a pocket knife, a simple, practical tool, not a gift. "In this family," Eli said, his voice gruff with unshed emotion, "we build things, we don't break them. If you ever need to cut something loose, make sure it's the thing that's holding you back, not the thing that's holding you up." Finn didn't become a chatterbox, but he became a shadow in the garage, watching Eli with a silent, unnerving focus. He absorbed everything. The way Eli diagnosed a faulty injector by its sound, the way he negotiated a freight contract with nothing but a handshake and the steadfast, unblinking reliability of a man who kept his word. The business grew, slowly, from 1 truck to 3, then 5. Eli had a vision. The big logistics companies bled money through inefficiency, but they guarded their routes and supplier lists like state secrets. Eli's advantage was simpler. He talked to people. He knew every mechanic, every dispatcher, every warehouse foreman in the Midwest by name. He built a network not on proprietary software, but on trust. Finn, alongside Leo, helped digitize that trust. Leo, who had a gift for numbers, built the company's first logistics database from scratch on a second-hand desktop. Finn, who had a mind for structures and absolutes, read every contract, every regulatory statute, every line of print. The boy who was terrified of a system that had failed him found his power in mastering it. "The law isn't a shield for the weak until they know how to hold it," Finn had murmured once, deep in a law book he'd borrowed from the public library, and Eli had felt a shiver of pride. Over 18 years, that small family business, run from a garage that smelled of oil and ambition, transformed into mid-continent freight solutions, a logistics empire with a fleet of 400 trucks, a regional air cargo hub, and a proprietary tracking system that the old giants were desperate to buy. Eli, still wearing his battered leather vest and work boots, was a legend, a folk hero of the American highway. To the drivers, he was Pops. To the board of directors, investors who had been necessary to fuel the explosive growth, he was an anachronism, a stubborn relic standing in the way of quarterly profit projections.
The danger didn't announce itself with a thunderclap. It arrived in the form of Arthur Crawley, the chairman of the board. He was a financial engineer, a man who believed companies were not built, but assembled, stripped for parts, and resold. He wore Armani suits and a smile that never touched his glacier blue eyes. He had spent 2 years slowly, methodically buying up minority shares and whispering poison into the ears of the other board members. Eli Vance was a legacy risk, a sentimentalist whose commitment to family values was a barrier to the streamlined profitability that a merger with a giant like Kraus Global Transport would bring. Crawley's weapon was a contract, a massive 7-year shipping deal with a national auto parts chain, a deal that Eli had personally negotiated. Crawley, through a network of loyal subordinates, had manufactured evidence that Eli had received a personal kickback on the contract, a paper trail of shell companies, a fabricated offshore account, all of it leading to a single damning document with a signature that looked exactly like Eli's. The claim was that Vance and Son wasn't a name, it was a mechanism for nepotism and corporate theft. The kickback was allegedly funneled into a private trust, a Vance Family Legacy Fund, established solely to benefit Leo and Finn. The irony was a physical blow. The fund did exist. Eli had created it years ago, not as a slush fund, but as a protective trust containing his personal founding shares, designed to act as a poison pill against exactly the kind of predatory takeover Crawley was now attempting. It was a fortress. Crawley's genius was accusing the fortress of being a secret vault of stolen money. The accusation was a bomb. The board called an emergency session. A vote was scheduled to freeze Eli's shares, strip him of his executive authority, and push through a merger with Kraus Global, a company famous for hostile takeovers, mass layoffs, and selling off assets. In the week leading up to the boardroom confrontation, Eli's world constricted. The legal assault was relentless. A preliminary injunction was filed. The media, tipped off by Crawley, ran stories of the highway hypocrite, the blue-collar hero who was secretly a fraud. From truck stop to fraud shop, one headline screamed. Eli, who had weathered recessions, fuel crises, and the death of his beloved Esther, faced a storm that couldn't be outdriven. He sat in his office, not looking at financial statements, but at a framed photo from the night the adoption was finalized. A tired man in a worn flannel shirt stood with a skinny, wary-eyed boy who was trying not to smile. The slogan on the wall behind them, hand-painted by Esther before she died, was his company's only true motto, "Keep the promise." He called Leo, who was now his VP of operations. Leo was a rock, steady, furious, ready to fight. But he also called Finn, and called him again. Finn, who had earned a full scholarship to an Ivy League law school, who was now a rising star at a prestigious corporate law firm in Chicago, specializing in securities fraud and shareholder litigation. Finn was the only person with the legal firepower to match Crawley's mercenary lawyers, but Finn's phone went straight to voicemail. His office said he was on a leave of absence. His apartment was empty. He had vanished. The silence was a second betrayal, more painful than the first. Arthur Crawley, in a private meeting with the board, spread the final layer of poison. Even his own adopted son, he said with a theatrical sigh, the boy he supposedly saved from the gutter, has abandoned him. He knows the ship is sinking. He's a smart lawyer. He won't tie his future to a sinking fraud. Leo, overhearing this from a loyal secretary, almost launched himself across the boardroom table, but was held back by a family friend. Eli received the news in quiet agony. Eli said, "Finn owed me nothing," his voice cracking. "I didn't take him in to collect a debt. I took him in because he was cold, and I had a blanket."
But Finn Vance had not abandoned his father. He was doing what Eli had taught him on 1,000 cold nights in the garage. He was tracing the problem back to its source, diagnosing the fault. He had been contacted by Arthur Crawley 3 weeks earlier. Crawley, in a monumental miscalculation, had tried to buy him off. The offer was breathtaking: a guaranteed partnership at Kraus Global's legal division, a golden parachute severance for his father, and a clean, painless end to the whole affair. All Finn had to do was stay out of it, to not show up, to let his silence affirm the lie. Finn had recorded the entire meeting, legally. He had lured Crawley's intermediary into a state with one-party consent recording laws. He had the evidence of witness tampering. But he needed more. He needed the smoking gun that proved the financial trail was fabricated. So he had gone dark. He had gone back to the beginning. He traveled to the tiny, dying town in Nebraska where the auto parts chain had been founded, to a dusty records vault in the basement of a retired judge's office. He was searching for the original notarized pre-digital minutes of a meeting from 7 years prior, a meeting where a specific handwritten clause had been added to the contract by the client himself. Late on the second night, alone in the moldering basement with a single hanging bulb for light, Finn found it. It wasn't a file. It was a bound leather ledger, the kind people used before the cloud. He flipped through the pages, his hands trembling slightly, until he found it, the original contract addendum. And in the margin, in the spidery handwriting of the long-dead founder of the auto parts chain, was a note. Vance's legacy fund structure approved per my request. A safeguard, not a theft. A man who plans to protect his company for 50 years is the only one I'll trust for 7. Beside it was a Polaroid photo of Eli and the founder, shaking hands, the original Legacy Fund trust document clearly sitting on the table between them, a time-stamped analog read receipt from a man who didn't trust computers. The man legally, explicitly approved the fund structure as a condition of the deal. The kickback narrative was not just a lie, it was a fiction that collapsed the moment the truth, sourced directly from the past, was brought into the light. Finn scanned every page with a portable scanner, made multiple encrypted backups, and put the original ledger into a fireproof, waterproof courier's pouch. He had not just found evidence, he had found an origin story that vindicated everything. The boardroom of Mid-Continent Freight Solutions was on the 40th floor of a glass tower, a sterile box of cold light and expensive anxiety. The long, polished table reflected the grim faces of 12 directors. Eli sat at the head, looking small and out of place, a weathered lion surrounded by hyenas. Beside him was a well-meaning but outgunned corporate lawyer, a man who looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. Arthur Crawley commanded the other end of the table, flanked by a team of legal sharks. The air was thick with the smell of expensive cologne and imminent victory. "The vote is a formality, Eli," Crawley said, his voice a silken dagger. "The forensic accountants have tied the legacy fund directly to the kickback payments. Your signature is on the shell company's formation documents. The narrative is tragic. The old hero who built an empire, corrupted by a misguided love for a stray. Let's end this cleanly. You can retire. Spend time with your real son. The adopted one has already read the writing on the wall." He gestured to Finn's empty chair with a theatrically sad smile. That's when the doors surrendered. They swung open in absolute silence, and Finn Vance walked in. He wasn't the scrawny, rain-soaked boy anymore. He was a man forged in a crucible of discipline. His suit was a suit of armor. His eyes were chips of obsidian, and he carried the leather courier's pouch like a holy relic. He didn't look at Crawley. He looked at Eli, and for a fraction of a second, the flinty hardness in his eyes softened into something fierce and protective. "Sorry I'm late, Mr. Vance. Traffic was a beast," he said, his voice calm and resonant, filling the space Crawley's sneer had just occupied. "But I brought something for our friends." He placed the pouch on the table with a solid thump that made a few directors jump. "Arthur Crawley," Finn said, turning, his voice now devoid of all warmth, "you have a beautiful theory, a corrupted father, a sentimental mistake. But a theory is just a story until it meets a fact. I have come with an avalanche of them." He opened the pouch. He didn't rush. He was performing a ritual. He placed the Polaroid photo on the table first. The gasp was audible. Several old-school directors leaned in, recognizing the auto parts chain's founder. "Exhibit A," Finn said. "A digital image is easy to fake. This isn't a digital image. The metadata of this Polaroid, the chemical composition of the film, the paper stock, will be authenticated by our experts. It is a time-stamped witness to a contract negotiation. It clearly shows the legacy fund document as a pre-existing, client-approved vehicle." Arthur Crawley's lead lawyer, a man named Sterling, scoffed. "This is a circus act, a sentimental prop. A photo proves nothing about financial transactions 7 years later." He didn't wait for permission. He launched his first brutal assault. He attacked the boy. "Mr. Vance, the younger, let's not pretend you were an objective party. You are not a lawyer for this company. You are a beneficiary of the alleged fraud. The stray made good. Your entire life, your education, your suit, your degree was funded by Eli Vance. You are not here for justice. You are here to protect your inheritance. You are so deeply in your adoptive father's debt that you cannot see straight." The accusation was a personal, calculated, humiliating blow. It was the weaponization of a father's love. Finn didn't flinch. He let the silence hang for 5 full seconds, until Sterling's words echoed in the room and began to sound foolish even to himself. "You're right," Finn said, his voice perfectly level. "I am in his debt. But you've confused a debt with a promise. A debt is an obligation you resent. A promise is an identity you choose. My father never kept a ledger of what he gave me, so I don't stand here to settle a debt. I stand here because the promise he taught me is that we don't let liars steal what honest people have built. You want to talk about my history. My history is the single best testimony to the moral architecture of this company. You see a vulnerability. I am the living proof of its integrity." And then Finn went on the offensive. "But you, Mr. Sterling, represent a client who understood that the only way to break Eli Vance was to attack his family. So Mr. Crawley tried to remove me from the equation entirely." Finn produced a small audio player. Exhibit B, a recording, legally obtained, of a meeting between myself and Harold Finch, a known agent of Kraus Global Transport, acting under instruction from Arthur Crawley. He pressed play. The voice of the intermediary, oily and conspiratorial, filled the room. "Arthur just wants your absence, Finn, a vacation, a silence. In return, you're not just a partner, you're a king. All this bitterness, this court fight, let's just make it go away, for everyone." The sound of Finn's cool reply, "And if I refuse to be bought, then your father's company is just a carcass to be picked clean, and you'll be just another buzzard on the heap." The boardroom was deadly silent. Arthur Crawley's face had gone a strange, mottled color. It wasn't the bribe that was damning, it was the admission. The audio acknowledged Eli's company would be destroyed only if Finn didn't comply. It was conspiracy, spoken in plain English. But Finn wasn't finished. He was only just beginning. "Now let's talk about the financial fiction." He produced the bound leather ledger. The drama of the ancient physical object was a calculated blow against the sterile digital world of the board. This is the minute book of the original auto parts contract, and in the margin of the final agreement, a note written and witnessed by the founder himself, explicitly approving the legacy fund structure as a condition of the deal. He laid a high-resolution scan of the page on the projector, the spidery handwriting magnified. The kickback story is a malicious re-narration of a client-initiated safeguard. The money didn't flow from the company to the fund. The fund was Eli's pre-existing personal vehicle, vetted and approved, which guaranteed his long-term commitment to the client. It wasn't a hidden benefit. It was the core selling point. Sterling, trying to regain control, sputtered, "This is fabricated. A marginal note in a 100-year-old book? This is a fantasy." "Ah," Finn said, a predator smiled, barely touching his lips. "Allow me to introduce Exhibit C." He pulled out a certified copy of a chain of custody document. This ledger has been continuously held in the private climate-controlled vault of Judge Henry M. Tolliver Estate since the day the contract was signed. Judge M. Tolliver was the founder's personal lawyer. We have the sworn affidavit of his son, the estate executor, verifying this ledger has never been tampered with, never been in Eli Vance's possession, and was discovered by me on this date in the presence of 2 court reporters whose affidavits are also included. The ink used on this marginal note is from a specific batch manufactured in 1982 and discontinued in 1987. I have a forensic chemist ready to testify under oath that this ink matches that batch perfectly. So, Mr. Sterling, are you calling the long-deceased Judge M. Tolliver a co-conspirator? Or do you want to admit that your entire case is a house of cards built on a lie? The silence that followed wasn't just the absence of sound. It was the death of ambition. Arthur Crawley's lead lawyer, Sterling, opened his mouth, but nothing came out. He was a technical lawyer, facing a truth that was not just factual, but physical and absolute. Finn delivered the killing blow. "But the single most damning piece of evidence is your own," Finn said, pulling a final document from the pouch. "Before coming here, I served a discovery request on the accounting firm you hired, Mr. Crawley, the one that found the offshore account. In their haste to please their client, they sent me their internal audit trail. They didn't realize the metadata was embedded. He placed the sheet on the table. This is a time-stamped log. It shows that the shell company account you claim belonged to Eli Vance was created 4 months after the contract was signed, and the supposed kickback transfer date was manually overridden in their system by a junior analyst at 2:13 a.m. on a Sunday. An analyst who, coincidentally, is your nephew by marriage, Mr. Crawley. The fraud wasn't a clever embezzlement. It was a clumsy, desperate fabrication. A collective shuddering breath was drawn by every director at the table. One of them, a silver-haired woman who had been cautiously siding with Crawley, stood up. "I think," she said, her voice trembling with rage, "we've heard enough. Security, please escort Mr. Crawley and his legal team from the building, and someone call the police. This is a criminal matter now." As security guards closed in, Arthur Crawley lost all composure. The urbane mask cracked, revealing a core of panicked fury. "This isn't over, Vance. You think a sentimental story about a runaway orphan can protect you from the real world?" Finn walked calmly toward his father, placing the leather pouch, the instrument of salvation, in front of Eli. He turned to face Crawley one last time. "You still don't get it," Finn said, his voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the silent room. "You thought my father's greatest weakness was his sentimentality, his habit of picking up strays. But his promise to a rain-soaked kid wasn't a liability. It was the seed that grew the only weapon you could never defend against. He didn't just save a boy, Arthur. He taught that boy to build a fortress, and you, in your arrogance, handed me the keys. The family you tried to tear apart just tore your conspiracy to shreds."
The boardroom emptied. The directors filed out, most refusing to make eye contact with the disgraced former chairman. In the end, only Eli and Finn remained in the massive, silent room. The city lights of Omaha glittered coldly outside the floor-to-ceiling windows. Eli Vance, the trucker who had built an empire, looked at his son, his eyes red-rimmed with exhaustion and a profound aching relief, saw not the sharp lawyer in a $2,000 suit. He saw a shivering 15-year-old kid on a dark highway, blue-lipped and brave enough to accept a cup of bitter coffee. "You disappeared," Eli said, his voice a hoarse whisper. I thought you'd finally decided I wasn't worth the trouble." Finn's professional composure fractured. A flash of the old guarded pain returned to his eyes. "You told me once," Finn said, "to cut loose the thing that was holding me back." Crawley had to believe I was gone. He had to feel so safe that he got sloppy. "If you knew what I was doing, you'd have tried to protect me, and he would have seen it. You would have tipped the whole thing. For once in my life, I had to be the one to do the protecting." Eli stood up, and in that moment he looked his full 71 years, but his frame was unbowed. He walked to Finn and placed both of his grease-worn, calloused hands on his son's shoulders. "I didn't adopt you so you could save the company," Eli said. "I know," Finn replied, his voice thick. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, familiar object, the pocket knife, its handle worn smooth from years of use. "You gave me this and told me to build. You didn't give me a company. You gave me a family, a name and a code. I didn't come back to save an empire. I came back to honor the promise, the one you made to me on the side of the road. You don't drive past someone who's out of options, not in the rain, not in the cold, not ever." Finn placed the pocket knife in his father's hand. "You kept your promise to a boy who was out of options. Today, I'm only giving you back the key to the empire you built." Eli closed his hand around the knife. The $900 million company was secure, the hostile takeover dismantled, the conspirators headed for a criminal investigation. But the truest victory was in the simple weight of that old knife, a gift that had become a destiny. A year later, at a massive company picnic held in a sprawling truck depot, Eli stood on a makeshift stage, his son Leo on one side, Finn on the other. The entire family, thousands of drivers, mechanics, dispatchers, and warehouse workers, stood before him. Eli told them the story, not the glossy corporate version, but the real one. The one about a rainstorm, a bitter cup of coffee, and a scared kid who was only ever one bad turn away from being lost forever. He didn't tell it to polish his own legacy. He told it so every single person there would know that the soul of their company wasn't an algorithm or a stock ticker. It was a promise that no one in this family would ever be left out in the cold. And as he finished, Finn Vance, the runaway boy who had become the company's guardian, looked out at the sea of faces and felt for the first time in his life a sense of complete and unshakable belonging. The circle was closed, the promise was kept, the empire was not just saved, it was finally, truly, a home. If this story of loyalty, patience, and absolute justice moved your heart, then you know what to do. Hit that like button to honor the promise, share this video so everyone knows what true integrity looks like, and subscribe with every notification bell on so you never miss a story in the future.